The pump made a sound Sarah Kessler had never heard it make before, a dry, rasping cough, like something choking on air instead of water. She stood at the head of the irrigation ditch with a coffee mug going cold in her hand, waiting for the familiar rush to start, the way it had every morning for the 11 years she'd run this ranch alone. It didn't come. She walked the length of the ditch in her boots, past the stock tank, past the low pasture where Leo's cattle, hers now, but she still thought of them as her father's some mornings, stood restless at the fence line. The ditch was dry all the way down. Not low, not slow, dry, with a crust already forming on the mud at the bottom, the particular cracked pattern that meant this hadn't happened overnight. Mom. Leo was 11 years old, quiet in the specific way of kids who spend more time outdoors than in front of a screen, and he was standing at the gate that led up toward the boundary line, looking at something Sarah couldn't see yet. Where did the water go? She found the answer at the top of the property line, where the shared feeder line crossed from Vance land onto Kessler land through an old metal gate valve her father had shown her how to read when she was younger than Leo was now. The valve was closed. Not stuck, not broken, closed, deliberately, all the way, with a fresh brass padlock through the latch that hadn't been there a week earlier. Arthur Vance was standing on the other side of the fence when she got there, like he'd been waiting. He didn't apologize. He didn't pretend it was an accident, or blame the drought, or offer any of the small mercies a person might expect from a neighbor who'd known her family for 30 years. You had a good run, he said. It's time to sell. Sarah looked at the padlock, then at him, understanding in the space of a few seconds that this was not a misunderstanding she could talk her way out of by the end of the afternoon. That valve feeds 60 head of cattle, Arthur. You know that. I do. Then turn it back on. I will, he said, in the same even, unhurried tone he'd used for 6 years of polite offers. The day you signed the papers my office sent out last month. Otherwise I'd start hauling water if I were you. It's going to be a long August. He got back in his truck without waiting for her answer, and Sarah stood at the fence for a long moment after he'd gone, Leo beside her now, both of them looking at a padlock neither one had the tools or the legal footing, yet, to remove. 3 days earlier, none of this had seemed inevitable, but Sarah had never understood why Arthur Vance wanted her 80 acres so badly in the first place, especially when the man already owned 11,000 acres of ranch land and had enough money to buy better ground 10 times over without ever noticing the cost. He had been trying to buy her out for 6 years, starting with polite letters delivered by his ranch manager, then increasingly persistent visits timed for the moments when he knew she'd be sitting at the kitchen table with the ranch books spread in front of her, always presenting the offer as a kindness to a struggling widow who shouldn't have to carry 80 acres by herself. What Sarah could never explain was why this particular 80 acres mattered to him, and she wouldn't begin to understand the answer until her 11-year-old son noticed something in a dry ravine that everyone else had overlooked for decades. She'd refused every time. Not out of spite, and not out of any illusion that the ranch was thriving. It wasn't, and she knew it. She refused because this particular 80 acres was the only thing her father, Walter Kessler, had managed to leave her. Every rancher out here seemed to carry some version of the same stubborn arithmetic, where land wasn't worth what it produced so much as what it had cost somebody to keep. The answer was connected to something Arthur had inherited from his own father, something neither Sarah nor most of the people in Bickford understood yet, and it was the reason his 6 years of polite offers had suddenly turned into a locked valve in the middle of the hottest month of the year. Sarah would eventually learn what that reason was, but for now all she knew was that Arthur had stopped asking her to sell and had started trying to make staying impossible. He never said any of this to Sarah. He just kept offering and kept getting refused until the morning he decided to stop asking. Sarah had been alone on the ranch for 4 years by then, since her husband Mark died in a trucking accident on the county highway 2 miles from their own gate, hauling feed home in weather he shouldn't have been driving in. She'd thought, in the first year after, about selling then. Grief has its own arithmetic, and for a while the ranch had felt less like an inheritance and more like a weight she wasn't sure she had the strength to keep carrying alone with an 8-year-old to raise. What kept her from selling wasn't Mark's memory, exactly. It was her father's, older and stranger, the particular stubbornness of a man who'd spent his whole life treating this land like something owed a debt rather than something to extract value from. She still thought about Mark most mornings, standing at the same stretch of fence he used to check before a storm out of habit more than necessity. He'd been the practical one of the two of them, better with machinery, worse with the land itself in the specific way people are when they grow into a place instead of growing up in it. He'd married into the ranch the way Sarah's own father had married into it a generation earlier, and there was a particular symmetry in that she'd never quite let herself examine too closely. Leo had his father's steadiness more than his mother's stubbornness. Most days, though she was beginning to suspect, watching him disappear toward the ravine every afternoon that summer, that he'd inherited more of her father's quiet persistence than either of them had noticed yet. The town had opinions about all of it, the way small towns do. Some of the older ranchers respected her for holding on. A few, quietly, thought she was being foolish. Dolores at the diner counter had told Sarah more than once over coffee that there was no shame in taking Vance's money and starting somewhere easier. Nobody would think less of you, Dolores said one morning, refilling a cup Sarah hadn't touched. I would, Sarah told her, and that was the end of that particular conversation, though it wouldn't be the last time someone in town assumed her refusal was pride rather than something closer to a promise she didn't fully understand herself yet. Vance's ranch manager, a soft-spoken man named Deacon Ruiz who'd worked for the family for close to 20 years, had been the one to deliver most of the earlier offers. Always polite, always apologetic in a way that made it harder for Sarah to stay angry at him specifically even as she refused every number he brought. He came by one final time about a week before the water stopped, sat at her kitchen table because she offered him coffee out of old habit, and told her, in a rare moment that felt like it wasn't entirely part of his job description, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Kessler, I've told Arthur more than once that this particular piece isn't worth the trouble he's putting into it. He doesn't listen to me on this one. Never has." He didn't explain further, and she didn't press him, though she'd remember that conversation clearly enough, weeks later, to understand exactly what kind of trouble he'd meant. Leo asked the question that night that Sarah didn't have an honest answer for yet. Are we going to have to leave? Like the town's been saying. She'd heard the talk too. Bickford was small enough, word moved fast enough, and half the county had already decided Sarah Kessler would be selling by the end of the month, the way water shortages tended to settle these things out here. She looked at her son across a kitchen table with Vance's typed offer sitting on it. Folded once, the number circled in his ranch manager's neat hand, and she folded it again and put it in her shirt pocket instead of answering him directly. We're not going anywhere, she said. Get some sleep. Later that night, going through a drawer for bills that needed paying, she found something she hadn't looked at in years. Her father's old ranch journal, water-stained along the spine, mostly grazing rotations and calving records and weather notes in his cramped handwriting. One line, near the back, stopped her without any context to explain why he'd written it. The land remembers where the water is. Whatever else changes, that never does. She read it twice, filed it away as one more thing her father had said that made more sense to him than to her, and went to bed without understanding yet that she'd just found the first piece of something that would take weeks to fully assemble. The next stretch of days became a routine that wore Sarah down in a way she hadn't expected, even after 11 years of knowing exactly how unforgiving this land could be. Every morning before sunrise, she loaded two 500-gallon plastic tanks onto the bed of a truck old enough to groan under the weight, drove the 40 minutes into Bickford, filled them from the municipal pump at a rate that ate into savings she didn't have much of, and drove back to keep 60 head of cattle from what would otherwise have been a slow and entirely preventable death. The tanks sloshed the whole way home. The truck's suspension complained on every rut. By the third week, her hands had a permanent rawness to them that no amount of lotion touched, and the number in her bank account had a shape she didn't like looking at directly anymore. The heat made everything worse in ways that were hard to explain to anyone who hadn't lived through a Texas August without reliable water. The cattle grew restless in the mornings, gathering at the empty stock tank out of habit before the truck even made it back from town. And there was a particular sound 60 thirsty animals made together that Sarah had never heard before this summer and hoped never to hear again once it was over. Leo helped where an 11-year-old could, running the hose, checking the smaller trough by the barn, keeping the chickens watered while his mother made the long drive. And there was a specific morning, deep in the second week, when Sarah caught him sitting on the tailgate of the truck at 5 a.m., already dressed, already waiting, without being asked. She didn't have the heart to tell him to go back to bed. Some mornings, she needed the company more than the sleep. Vance didn't need to do anything further. He'd told her as much, in his own way, the second time he drove past her fence line in an air-conditioned truck and simply watched her wrestling a hose without getting out to help or hurt. He had time. The drought would do the rest of his work for him. He came back once more, 10 days in, with a lower number this time, delivered by the same ranch manager, no apology attached to the reduction. Sarah refused again. She was too tired that particular evening to explain why to anyone, including herself, beyond the fact that some math doesn't run on dollars. Leo, meanwhile, had started disappearing for stretches of the afternoon while his mother hauled water, not far, never past the property line, but long enough that Sarah noticed and didn't have the energy most days to ask where. He was a quiet boy, the kind who noticed things adults were too busy or too tired to notice, and what he'd noticed, 3 weeks into the drought, was a patch of ground in the bottom of an old dry ravine that didn't look like the rest of the property. Everywhere else, dead grass, the color of old paper, brittle enough to crackle under his boots. But down in the ravine, tucked against a low limestone bank, there was a patch no bigger than a kitchen table where the grass stayed green. Not lush, not obviously alive, just stubbornly, quietly green in a way that made no sense next to everything dying around it. He kept going back to it, most afternoons, the way you return to a puzzle you haven't solved yet. There were details that took him several visits to notice, each one adding a small weight to the same growing suspicion. Grasshoppers, which had stripped every other green thing on the property down to stubble, left that particular patch almost entirely alone, as though something about it didn't suit them. Ants moved differently there too. He watched a line of them curve wide around the edge of the green instead of crossing straight through it, the way ants avoid standing water even when none was visible on the surface. There was moss, actual moss, dark green and faintly slick, growing on the north side of a half-buried stone he'd assumed for years was just another piece of the limestone bank. And moss, he knew even at 11, didn't grow anywhere in this county without a reliable source of moisture feeding it from below. He knelt down and pressed his palm flat against the dirt. It was cold. Not cool the way shaded dirt gets cool. Cold, the specific cold of something with water still moving underneath it, even in August, even after 3 weeks without rain and a legally engineered drought doing everything in its power to kill every green thing on the property. He told his mother about it that evening. There's a wet patch. Down in the ravine. The dirt's cold, Mom. And there's moss on one of the rocks. And the grasshoppers won't go near it. Sarah, half asleep at the kitchen table with a stack of unpaid bills in front of her, gave him the kind of distracted, exhausted answer a parent gives when they don't have the bandwidth left for anything that isn't the immediate crisis. That ground's always been strange down there. Probably just shade. It's not shaded, Leo said. But she'd already turned back to the bills, and he let it go for the night, filing the detail away the way he seemed to file most things, quietly, and for later. He didn't let it go for good, though. Over the following 10 days, in the scraps of time between chores, he returned to the ravine with a bent piece of rebar he'd found in the shed, probing the soil around the edge of the green patch, mapping in his own head where the cold ground started and stopped. By the end of that stretch, without ever telling his mother the extent of it, he'd worked out that the cold, damp boundary formed something close to a straight edge on one side, not the ragged shape water usually made when it simply seeped up through soil, but a line, like something built rather than something natural. The breaking point came in the 4th week, during a heat wave severe enough to make the National Weather Service issue warnings for the whole county. The municipal pump in Bickford broke down entirely, cutting off even the expensive, humiliating lifeline Sarah had been running on, and for 2 full days there was no water to haul at any price. She spent those 2 days rationing what remained in the tank by the barn, watching 60 animals drink less than they needed, and knowing exactly how many more days they could survive on less before it stopped being a hardship and started being a real, irreversible loss. Leo helped without being asked, carrying buckets from the smallest reserve to the weakest calves first, the same instinct for triage he'd bring, without either of them realizing it yet, to a dying green patch in a dry ravine less than a week later. Vance drove by that second day. He didn't stop long. just slowed at the fence line long enough to see her standing in the dead pasture with an empty tank on the truck bed, long enough to make sure she saw him seeing it, and then drove on toward his own green, irrigated fields without a word. That evening, Leo found her sitting on the porch steps instead of at the table, and sat down beside her without saying anything for a while, the way he'd apparently learned to do from watching her get through the hard year after his father died. "Do you think Dad would sell?" he finally asked. "If he was here instead of you?" Sarah thought about it longer than she expected to. "Your dad wasn't from here," she said. "He married into this place the way I guess I did too. If you go back far enough, my mother's people, then my father's, then his. He loved it because I loved it. If it came down to it, I think he would have looked at me and done whatever I decided, because that's who he was. He never would have told me what to choose. He just would have hauled water beside me until I figured it out." She looked out at the dead pasture. "So, I suppose the question's still just mine to answer either way." That night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with his offer unfolded in front of her for the first time in weeks, a pen in her hand, closer than she'd let herself get to actually signing it. She was tired in a way that had stopped being about sleep a long time ago. She thought about her father, about the journal entry she still didn't understand, about 80 acres that were killing her slowly instead of quickly, and for a long moment the number on the page looked less like a betrayal and more like mercy. She didn't sign it, but she came close enough that night to understand, for the first time, exactly what Vance had been counting on the whole time. Leo didn't come in for breakfast the next morning. Sarah found him 20 minutes later, down in the ravine, covered in black mud to the elbows, digging at the green patch with a hand trowel he'd taken from the shed without asking. He looked up at her with the particular focus of a kid who'd stopped noticing time passing. "It's not just wet," he said. "It's cold all the way down. I want to see how far it goes." She should have told him to stop. She was too tired, too close to signing away the ground he was kneeling on, to summon the energy for anything but curiosity of her own. She grabbed the full-sized spade from the truck bed and knelt down beside her son in the mud. They dug for the better part of 2 hours, trading off blistering hands that were already raw from 3 weeks of hauling water tanks. The soil went from loose topsoil to dense, packed clay that fought every inch, a deep reddish clay that clung to the shovel blade and had to be scraped off by hand every third or fourth strike. The sun was climbing by then, and sweat mixed with the mud until neither of them could tell anymore which was which. And still Sarah kept digging, past the point where exhaustion should have made her stop, because some instinct older than tiredness had taken hold of her the same way it seemed to have taken hold of Leo weeks earlier. Sarah had almost decided to call it, for Leo's sake, for her own exhaustion, when her spade struck something that didn't give the way clay gives. It clinked. Not a rock. She knew rock, had hit plenty of it over 11 years of fence post holes. This had a different sound, hollow and structured, and when she cleared the mud away with her bare hands, she found the unmistakable edge of cut stone, not a natural formation, but blocks, mortared together, laid by hands a very long time ago. "Mom," Leo said very quietly. "What is that?" They cleared it together, slower now. Careful in the particular way people get careful when they realize they've found something that predates them by a century. What emerged, over the better part of another hour, was a small stone structure. A box, roughly waist-high, hand-cut limestone blocks mortared with something long gone brittle and crumbling, capped with a heavy flat stone lid that had settled deep into the surrounding clay. The masonry had the unmistakable look of something built by hand, without power tools, each block slightly uneven in a way that modern construction never was, fitted together anyway with the patient precision of somebody who'd expected the structure to outlast him. Sarah had grown up on this land and had never once heard mention of it. Not from her father, not from the county records she'd sorted through more times than she could count while trying to keep the ranch's books straight. Whatever this was, it had been buried and forgotten long before she was born. She wedged an iron pry bar, the same one she used for fence work, under the lip of the stone lid, and threw her whole exhausted weight against it. It resisted for a long moment, decades of settled earth holding it in place, and then, with a sound like the ground itself exhaling, it gave. Water erupted upward. Not a trickle, not a seep. A real, pressurized rush of water, ice cold even in the August heat, spilling over the mortared stone and running down into the dry ravine bed in a spreading dark stain that seemed, in that first moment, like the most impossible thing Sarah had ever seen on this property. It kept coming, steady and forceful, filling the old channel bed within minutes. The sound of it. Real, moving water, after a month of dry silence. Enough to draw two of the horses down from the upper pasture to stand at the edge of the ravine and simply stare, the way animals sometimes understand something is significant before people fully catch up. She sat back in the mud, soaked, blistered, crying in a way she hadn't let herself do in front of Leo in years, and didn't try to explain it to him because she didn't have an explanation yet herself. They had found an artesian spring, a source old enough to predate the ranch itself, buried, as they'd later learned from an old county geological survey, by a significant mudslide nearly 100 years earlier that had rerouted an entire section of the original creek bed and swallowed whatever structure had once channeled this water above ground. It had been sitting in the dark under a dead pasture the entire time Sarah had been slowly losing the fight to keep this land alive, patient in a way nothing else on the ranch that summer had been. The days that followed the discovery were, in their own way, almost as physically demanding as the drought had been, though the exhaustion carried a different weight now, the kind that comes from work you can see paying off in real time, rather than work that only slows a loss. Sarah and Leo spent the better part of a week clearing the old channel by hand, hauling out silt and collapsed earth in 5-gallon buckets. Following what turned out to be a deliberately engineered path, some long-forgotten settler had cut through the limestone to guide the water down toward what would once have been a homestead site near the ravine's mouth. By the fourth day, the flow had stabilized into something Sarah could actually measure. She borrowed a bucket and a stopwatch from her phone and worked out, roughly, that the spring was producing somewhere near 50 gallons a minute, cold and mineral clean, more than enough for 60 head of cattle with plenty left to spare. She trenched a path from the old channel down toward the main stock tank, and stood at the fence line the evening the water finally reached it, watching cattle that had spent a month growing gaunt and restless drink easily, unhurried, the way livestock drinks when there's no longer any reason to compete for what's available. The days that followed were, in their own way, almost as much work as the drought had been, clearing the old channel of a century of silt and collapsed earth, trenching a path down toward the stock tank, watching with something close to disbelief as the flow held steady, strong, more than enough for 60 head of cattle and the beginning of a garden that might actually survive the season. But this is not where the story ends, and Sarah would learn that within the week, in a conversation she hadn't expected to have this soon. Word travels fast in a county this size, and the first version of it that made the rounds at the diner counter wasn't especially kind. A few of the regulars, men who'd known Sarah's father, who'd watched her haul water all summer with a kind of pity that occasionally curdled into something less generous, laughed outright when Dolores mentioned it, assuming a widow and her son had simply gotten lucky finding a puddle in a wash after a stray thunderstorm 2 counties over. Probably just seepage off Vance's own pivot line, one of them said, loud enough that Dolores repeated it back to Sarah almost word for word the next time she came into town. Give it a week, it'll dry back up same as everything else out there. It took less than 4 days for a different, more accurate version of the story to reach Arthur Vance himself, and he did not laugh when he heard it. He didn't dismiss it as luck or seepage, the way half the county was still doing over coffee. Sarah learned this firsthand when he showed up at her gate on the 5th day, and for the first time in 6 years of dealing with the man, he looked genuinely unsettled. "Who showed you that spring?" he asked, before any greeting, before anything resembling the polished, patient tone he'd used on every visit before this one. "My son found it," Sarah said. "Why does it matter who showed us anything on our own land?" Vance didn't answer that directly. He looked past her, toward the ravine, toward the faint dark line of water now visible from the road, and something in his expression, a tightness around the eyes, a stillness that hadn't been there in 6 years of patient offers, told Sarah this was not the reaction of a man who'd simply lost a negotiation. He left without another word, and Sarah stood at her own gate for a long time afterward, understanding for the first time that the water shortage had never really been about her 80 acres in general. It had been about this specific 80 acres, this specific ravine, and whatever Vance already knew that she didn't. The letter arrived 6 days later on law firm stationery from a Midland address, and it took Sarah 2 readings to fully understand what it was actually claiming. Vance's attorneys argued that the original 1950s easement governing the shared feeder line, the same easement that had let him legally close the valve in the first place, contained language broad enough to cover all water sources, surface and subsurface, accessed via or adjacent to the described conveyance corridor. The ravine, they argued, sat close enough to that corridor that the newly discovered spring fell within its scope. They weren't asking to buy the land anymore. They were arguing Vance already had a legal claim to the water running through it, regardless of who held title to the dirt above it. Sarah read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then a third time out loud to Leo, who listened with the same still, focused attention he'd brought to the cold patch of dirt weeks earlier. "Can he do that?" Leo asked. "Just take it because of a piece of paper?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, and it was the most frightening sentence she'd said out loud all summer. More frightening in its way than the dry irrigation ditch had been, because a dry ditch was a problem she understood how to fight. A legal claim written in language she barely understood was not. She drove into Bickford the next morning and paid for 45 minutes of a lawyer's time she couldn't really afford. A tired, capable woman named Renata Ibarra, no relation to anyone Sarah knew, who read the letter twice with an expression that gave away nothing until she finally set it down. "It's aggressive," Renata said. "I won't tell you it's nothing. Easement language from the 50s can be vague enough that a good attorney can argue almost anything with it if a judge is willing to entertain the argument. So he can just take it." "I didn't say that." Renata pulled a legal pad toward her and started making notes as she talked, the way people do when they're already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. Vague language cuts both ways. It's also not automatically true just because they wrote it down and mailed it to you on nice letterhead. Courts don't love expanding old easements past their obvious original intent, especially against a family that's held clean title this whole time. "What I need from you is anything, any older document, any separate water right specific to your parcel that predates their easement and speaks to that spring directly. That's what beats this. Not outrage. Paper. Judges don't rule on who's more sympathetic, much as I wish they did in a case like yours. And if I don't find anything?" Renata didn't sugarcoat it. "Then it becomes a longer, more expensive fight than either of us wants, and I won't pretend the outcome's guaranteed. So go home and tear that house apart. Attics, old boxes, anything your father might have kept without telling you why. Men like that don't usually explain themselves while they're alive. They just leave the proof somewhere and trust somebody eventually goes looking." Sarah left that meeting with a bill she'd be paying off for months and a piece of advice that sent her back to her father's old drawer with a different kind of urgency than the one that had first found the journal. She found the answer, over the following 2 weeks, in her father's old papers, the same drawer where she'd found the journal, dug deeper now with a purpose she hadn't had before. Buried under decades of grazing leases and tax receipts was a folder she'd never had reason to open. An old hydrological survey, commissioned by the county in the 1960s, mapping an underground water system that ran beneath several properties along the county line, including, she now understood, both the Kessler and Vance ranches. The survey explained everything Vance had never said out loud. His father, decades earlier, had discovered that the family's land sat above a significant portion of the same aquifer system, and had spent years, a project Arthur himself had apparently continued, quietly acquiring the surrounding parcels needed to control the water source in its entirety. Not simply buying land for grazing. Buying up every property that touched the underground system, one purchase at a time, until only one holdout remained. Sarah's 80 acres. The repeated offers. The pressure. The water cutoff timed exactly when it would hurt most. It had never been about her ranch's grazing value, which was modest at best. It had been about the ground beneath it, ground that, as it turned out, held not just access to the shared system, but, buried in the ravine, an entirely separate, older source that predated every modern water right on either family's paperwork. But the survey alone wasn't enough. 2 weeks into the search, with Renata's 45 minutes long spent, and no clear document yet to counter the easement claim in Vance's letter, Sarah had a night that came closer to breaking her than any single day of hauling water had managed. It was past midnight, the kitchen table covered in loose papers going back 60 years, when she finally put her head down against her own arms and let herself cry the way she hadn't since the week Mark died. Not from grief this time, but from a specific, exhausted fear that she'd fought off a drought only to lose the water anyway to a piece of 50-year-old legal language she didn't have the resources to properly fight. Leo found her there near 1 a.m, having woken for a glass of water, and instead of going back to bed, he pulled out the chair beside her and started sorting through the same stack of papers without being asked, the way he'd started digging in the ravine without being asked, because some part of him had apparently decided a long time ago that waiting to be told what to do wasn't going to save this ranch. "We're not going to find it tonight," Sarah told him, more gently than she felt. "You should sleep." "You said the land remembers," Leo said, not looking up from the papers. "Grandpa's journal. You told me that. Maybe the paperwork does too. We just haven't found the right drawer yet." She didn't have an answer for that except to keep sorting, and it was nearly 3 a.m, both of them running on nothing but stubbornness, when she found it, not in the folder with the survey, but tucked inside the back cover of her father's journal itself, folded so many times it had gone soft at every crease. A handwritten water agreement, dated 1934, establishing an independent spring right specifically on the Kessler parcel, witnessed and filed at the county courthouse decades before Vance's family had purchased their first acre of grazing rights along that line. Vance had spent 6 years, and now a law firm's letterhead, acting as though he controlled the entire water supply along that county line. He never had. Not entirely. Sarah's father had known it, or something close to it, the whole time, and had kept the proof folded inside the one place he knew she'd eventually think to look, if she ever needed it badly enough. She drove into the county courthouse the next morning with the folded agreement in an envelope, half afraid the original filing wouldn't exist anymore, or would have been lost in some records fire or flood the way old county paperwork sometimes was. The clerk, a heavy-set man named Purvis who'd worked the records office long enough to remember Sarah's father coming in for grazing permits, pulled the relevant ledger from a back room that smelled like dust and old paper and took the better part of 20 minutes to find the corresponding entry. "Here it is," he said finally, turning the heavy book around so she could see it herself. Filed March of 1934. Witnessed by a Judge Ellery Combs, long since passed, and a notary whose seal's still legible if you look close. Water right, independent spring source. Parcel matches your current deed almost exactly. County's redrawn some boundary lines since then, but this falls square inside what's yours. He looked up at her over his glasses. "Your daddy ever mentioned this to you?" "No," Sarah said. "Not directly." Purvis made a photocopy, stamped it with the county seal, and slid it across the counter. "Well, he sure went to the trouble of making sure somebody could find it, whether he told you outright or not. That's not nothing." Renata confirmed it 2 days later, holding the certified copy up to the light like she still half expected it to dissolve. "This predates their easement by 20 years, she said. "It's specific to the parcel, specific to a named spring source, properly witnessed and filed. It doesn't just weaken their claim, Sarah. It ends it. I'll have a response letter out by Friday." The legal letter that arrived at the Vance Ranch that Friday was considerably shorter than the one Sarah had received, and considerably more final. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't loud. Sarah had expected, somewhere in the back of her mind, that a man who'd spent years quietly maneuvering toward this land would meet the loss of it with anger. Instead, when Vance came to the fence line a final time, he simply stood looking at the water for a long moment before he said anything at all. "My father spent 30 years on this," he finally said, not quite looking at her. "The whole system, every parcel along that aquifer, one purchase at a time, because he watched a drought in the 70s wipe out 3 ranches at once. Good people, families he'd grown up next to, and decided he'd never let a dry year put his own family at somebody else's mercy again. He stood at an auction as a boy and watched a neighbor's whole herd sold off for less than the debt on it. I inherited that project the way you inherited your father's stubbornness. I've spent most of my adult life finishing something he started before I was born. I don't expect you to feel sorry for me over it. I'm just telling you it was never as simple as a rich man wanting more." "That doesn't make it right," Sarah said. "You didn't just try to buy me out. You cut my water in the middle of a drought and stood there and watched me haul tanks by hand for a month, knowing exactly what it would cost me, because you decided my 80 acres were the last piece of something your father started. That's not inheritance. That's just cruelty with a family story attached to it. She let that sit for a moment before she went on, quieter now. I understand fear, Arthur. I buried a husband on this land and kept going anyway, with a kid to raise and no guarantee any of it would work out. I understand wanting to make sure the ground under your feet never disappears on you again. But you had 11,000 acres of insurance against that fear already. What you did to me wasn't protecting your family. It was making sure nobody else got to feel as safe as you'd already made yourself. He didn't argue the point. You could have asked, she said again, quieter now. I did, Vance said. No. Her voice was steady in a way it hadn't been in weeks. You offered to buy it. Every time, for 6 years. You never once asked me what it meant to keep it. You just assumed a number would be enough, because it would have been enough for you. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at the water a while longer, at the cattle drinking easily from a source that had no legal connection to anything his family had spent decades trying to consolidate. And then he turned and walked back to his truck without the offer he'd apparently come to make one final time. He never came back with another number. Word moved through Bickford the way it always did, slower than the drought had moved and twice as thoroughly. First it was just talk, people driving the county road a little slower past the Kessler gate, craning to see the green line of the ravine from the blacktop. Then it was Dolores, of all people, telling a table of regulars at the diner counter that she'd been wrong to ever suggest Sarah take Vance's money, and that she hoped Sarah would forgive her for saying so out loud where half the county could hear it. Then, 3 weeks after the legal letter went out, an older rancher named Hollis Pruitt showed up at Sarah's gate, hat literally in his hands. He'd lost close to 200 head that summer, doing everything by the book, every conventional method a modern operation was supposed to rely on, and he stood at her fence looking at pastures that had no business staying green through a drought that had gutted his own herd. I'm not proud, coming out here, he said. But I've farmed this county 31 years, and I've never seen anything like what you've got growing back there. I keep thinking about my own granddad's old papers, sitting in a box in my barn I've never once opened. Wondering if there's something in there I've been too stubborn to go looking for. There might be, Sarah said. There might not. I didn't know what I had until I ran out of every other option. Would you show me? What you and the boy found? How you looked? She spent that whole afternoon walking him through it. The journal, the county courthouse ledger, the specific patience it took to read 60-year-old handwriting for a single line that might matter. She asked nothing for it. No fee, no favor. And Hollis left near dusk with a new kind of attention in his face. The look of a man who'd spent 3 decades assuming the past held nothing left worth digging up, now headed home to a dusty box in his own barn. The last piece came from Leo, 3 days later, while he was helping clear the last of the silt from around the base of the old spring box. His trowel caught the edge of something buried at the base of the stone structure. A small, flat marker, deliberately placed, easy to miss unless you were exactly where he happened to be kneeling. He brushed the dirt away and found initials carved into the stone. WK. Mom, he called out. Come look at this. Sarah knelt beside the marker for a long time before she understood what she was looking at. Her father, Walter Kessler, had found this spring decades before either of them were born. He had known about it, had marked it deliberately, and had never once developed it, never told anyone, never even mentioned it beyond a single cryptic line in the back of a ranch journal. She understood why, sitting there, in a way that made the whole shape of the story finally settle into place. A man who'd spent his life watching neighbors and companies alike try to consolidate water rights across the county would have understood exactly what an untapped spring on his land was worth, and exactly what kind of attention it would draw the moment anyone else knew about it. He'd buried the knowledge the same way the mudslide had buried the spring itself, protecting it the only way he knew how, by making sure nobody, including his own daughter, would go looking until they truly needed to. The land remembers where the water is. Whatever else changes, that never does. He hadn't just been talking about the ground. He'd been leaving her the one piece of information that would save the ranch, decades before he had any way of knowing exactly when she'd need it, trusting that whenever the day came, the land itself would be the one to finally tell her. Months later, the ranch was green in a way Sarah hadn't seen it since she was a child. The spring held steady through the rest of that summer and the dry winter that followed. More than enough for the herd. Enough left over that she'd started talking, cautiously, with a neighbor 2 properties down about running a shared line. Not sold, not leased, offered, the way her father might have done it if he'd ever let himself trust the timing. The regional drought that had nearly broken her that August went on to hit the whole county hard through the following year. Vance's diverted creek, dependent entirely on a surface flow that had no deep source behind it, slowed to a muddy crawl by the following summer, and his irrigated fields, for the first time in years, went the same brittle brown that had once threatened to take Sarah's land instead of his. Hollis Pruitt's own search through his family's old county records turned up nothing quite as dramatic as an artesian spring, but it did turn up an older, forgotten, well casing near his south property line that his father had capped off decades earlier for reasons nobody living could explain, and reopening it, with equipment Sarah lent him without being asked twice, kept close to half his herd alive through a summer that would otherwise have finished what the first drought had started. He wasn't the only one. By the following spring, 3 other ranches along the county line had started digging through their own grandfather's paperwork, chasing the same rumor that had started with a boy kneeling in a dry ravine, that the land out here had always kept more in reserve than anyone still living had bothered to remember. She watched Vance drive past the fence line one evening that next August, slower than usual, looking at pastures that had no business being that green in a drought that bad. He didn't stop. There wasn't anything left to offer, and they both understood it by then. Leo was sitting by the spring that evening when she came to find him, the way he often did after chores, watching the water the same patient way he'd watched a strange cold patch of dirt months earlier, before either of them had understood what it meant. "You found it," Sarah said, sitting down beside him. "Before I ever would have." "I just noticed," Leo said. "It was already there. I just paid attention." Sarah thought about her father's line one more time, the one she finally understood completely now, that the land remembers what people forget, and that sometimes losing the thing you think you need most is exactly what forces you to find the thing that was underneath you the whole time. She thought, too, about Mark, who'd never gotten to see any of this, who would have liked Leo exactly the way he'd turned out, steady, watchful, willing to keep digging long after anyone else would have called it enough. Some inheritances came with a deed and a signature. This one, she understood now, had come folded into the back cover of a journal, waiting for the one summer it would actually be needed. If a story like this, where the water that was taken away turns out to be the reason a family finally discovers what they truly had, is the kind of thing that stays with you, subscribe. And if you've ever found something valuable hiding in the one place everyone had already given up on, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear it.